Well, welcome to today's Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare Research Seminar. I'm Georgia Mason, I'm Director of the Centre, and it's my huge pleasure today to introduce James Danckert. James is a Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Waterloo. He's originally from Australia, and he did his first degrees in Melbourne, and then after a postdoc in France, he moved to Canada around 20 years ago. And he's conducting really original research into the causes and correlates of human boredom, particularly what makes us susceptible to boredom. And he's interested in what are the functions of this annoying and distressing trait. And he's going to argue today that boredom has a long evolutionary history that we should pay attention to. So I'm really excited to hear about his work, both for its implications for us in our pandemic state where every day feels like Wednesday, and also his implications for animal welfare. So James, over to you.
Thanks very much, Georgia, and thanks everybody for coming and joining us today, particularly people coming from far and wide. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you about the work my students and I have been doing to try and understand boredom in humans, but particularly to this audience, I'm really looking forward to some of your insights and questions and to see where they lead. So as my title suggests, I'm going to try and convince you today that Eric Fromm was wrong. And Eric Fromm was a 20th century philosopher and sociologist who talked a lot about meaning and the fact that humans have this very strong need to make meaning. And the quote that I have here then is that man is the only animal that can be bored. And I want to suggest to you that he's wrong, that that's not true, that many other animals, perhaps even most animals, can experience boredom. But the key here is then, if he is wrong, what does that actually tell us about boredom? And any of you that have your own pets, your own pet dogs or something, will be quite aware of boredom. You know, if I leave my dog alone for too long, I come home to some torn up shoes. And so there's a fairly obvious kind of anecdotal sense in which boredom is obvious in animals. But one of the reasons why I'm talking to you today is that I've been doing the rounds in various sort of media outlets talking about our work on boredom. And I think I've talked to one of my favorite pieces of boredom of all time that comes from Georgia's lab and her work with Rebecca Mega, who's now out at Dalhousie. So if you'll allow me to geek out for a little bit on that study, I'll tell you a little bit about it. And Georgia, if I get any of the details wrong, please correct me. But what they essentially did is they had two groups of mink housed in different cages for 2 weeks. And so one group were housed in some cages that were pretty bland and had no real options for engagement for the animal. And the other group were housed in cages that had plenty of options for them to do things that mink normally enjoy. I don't know if you've ever seen mink in the wild, but they are quite impish little creatures. And so, putting them in these bland cages was a good chance to make them bored. After that 2-week period, they then exposed both groups of animals to different kinds of stimuli, things that the mink would normally approach. And this, I learned from this that mink apparently just love toothbrushes. So it's sort of like a laser pointer to a cat, which I think is pretty funny. And then they showed them a different class of objects, things that the animal would normally avoid. So the smell of urine of a predator, or the shadow or shape of silhouette of a predator. And then the third class of objects were neutral objects. They're just sort of water bottles. And the logic was really quite brilliant here. The idea is that if the animals were in the bland cages, the cages with no option for engagement, if they were depressed, then they would show no real interest in those things that they normally approached. So they wouldn't really care too much about the toothbrush. If they were apathetic, then they wouldn't approach any of the different kinds of stimuli that were shown to them. But if they were bored, they would indiscriminately approach all kinds of stimuli fairly rapidly, and the key here being indiscriminately. And that's precisely what they found. And they also found that the animals that had been housed in those bland cages tended to overeat treats at the end of the experiment. And this is something that we find in humans too. And perhaps in the pandemic, you might sort of recognize this in yourself, that when we're bored, we tend to overeat, and we also tend to overeat things that are not altogether that good for us. Now, most of us are aware that this picture of evolution is wrong in a whole range of different ways, but I just put it up here to highlight a couple of things that I think are important about that mink study. The first being that indeed Eric Fromm is wrong, that you can demonstrate, as Georgia and Rebecca did, that other animals experience boredom too. And the second thing, and I think that that this is the important part here, is that if other animals can indeed experience boredom, then somewhere in our evolutionary past, boredom was selected for. It serves some kind of function, some sort of purpose in our life. And I think that that's the important thing that we need to interrogate about boredom. So what is boredom? Well, boredom is a sort of motivational state, if you like, at least in humans. When we're bored, we find ourselves sort of disengaged from the environment around us, or disengaged from the task that we ought to be doing. And we want to be engaged. We sort of have this sort of conundrum of wanting to be doing something that matters to us, that is purposeful, meaningful to us, but we're failing to satisfy that want. So it's a negative feeling, a negative emotion, but also a motivating emotion, one that is sort of a call to action, pushing us to find something that will satisfy our desire to be fully engaged in the world. And I think pain provides a really useful analogy here. And I get this analogy from my good friend, Andreas Alpodoru, who's a philosopher at the University of Louisville. He's the one that should be credited with introducing this analogy to me. So the idea is that the function of pain is not to cause hurt. The function of pain is to sort of galvanize us into action. It's to address whatever caused the pain in the first place and then get us back on track with whatever we were doing before the pain arrived. So it's a real call to action. And in the same sense, the function of boredom is not to make us bored. It's to push us into action, to find something worth engaging in that is better, more rewarding, more satisfying than whatever it is that we're doing currently. So if boredom is a call to action, it's worth sort of talking about some recent studies that came out of Timothy Wilson's lab to highlight that notion that boredom might drive us to act, and that in some senses, that drive, that urge to act might not always lead to adaptive responses. So what Wilson and colleagues did is they had people sit in a room with nothing but their thoughts to occupy them. So they had removed cell phones, they'd removed their participants' backpacks. There was nothing actually physically in the room but a chair and a table. And they said, I'd like you to sit here for 15 minutes and just occupy yourself with your thoughts. And then at the end of the experience, they would ask people, well, how did that feel? How did you like that? And it's important because I think the media overplayed the results in this paper. It's important to state that about 1/3 of their participants said that they quite enjoyed it. They thought that that was a pleasant thing to do. Another third was sort of ambivalent. And the final third of the participants said that it was quite unpleasant and boring. But the key was their final experiment. In their final experiment, they asked people to sit in a room for 15 minutes with nothing but their thoughts to occupy themselves, or they could self-administer an electric shock. Prior to that 15 minutes, everybody had experienced the electric shock, so they knew what it felt like, and they had all expressed that they would pay some amount of money to avoid the electric shock in the future. And yet, when they had 15 minutes of nothing but their thoughts to occupy them, pretty much everybody self-administered an electric shock. Unsurprisingly, perhaps men more so than women, and one guy shocked himself 196 times in 15 minutes. That's going well beyond curiosity. And the suggestion here, from my point of view, is that the human animal is not comfortable doing nothing. We are more comfortable in a state of action or in a state of goal pursuit. And so in some instances, even an electric shock can seem more preferable than just doing nothing. And so if we cast boredom as this kind of call to action, then we can think about it in terms of what behavioral economists would refer to as opportunity costs. That is that anything that we do, any activity that we engage in, comes with some cost. That is the cost of not doing something else that might be more rewarding. The easiest way to think about this is to think about foraging. So, and the reason I do this too is because we'll come to foraging later on in the talk. And also it's a task that non-human animals do quite frequently, obviously. So I don't know if you've ever been to a pick your own berry farm, but if you have, you don't stand in front of a blueberry bush and totally denude it of all the berries that it has. That's not what we do. That's not what animals do either. You pick the berries that are sort of biggest and juiciest looking and that are relatively easy to find. And then at some point you say, it's getting too hard. I'm going to move on and find a better berry bush to pick the berries from. So this is this notion of opportunity costs. At some point you make a decision to say, what I'm doing now is not rewarding enough, I'm not getting enough good juicy berries. I'm going to explore my environment to do something else. And boredom is this push to explore your environment for some activity that's more engaging, more satisfying, that uses up more of your cognitive resources than whatever it is that you're doing right now. So we tested this notion that boredom was in fact a signal of rising opportunity costs by doing what was a sort of partial replication of the Wilson study. And we did this without asking people to have to administer self-administer electric shocks. We thought this would be easier to get past the ethics board. So we had two groups of people, one group that sat in a room with nothing but their thoughts to occupy them. And you see a picture of that on the left, and this is basically a replication of the Wilson study. Another group sat in a very similar room, but in that room, we put some objects in there that they could have interacted with. There was a half-finished jigsaw puzzle. There was a half-finished Lego puzzle that I stole from my son and brought into work. There was a browser open on a tablet that they could surf the internet for. But in that room, with all of those options for action, we told people you can look, but you can't touch. So in one room, there's nothing to do but think about your own thoughts. In the other room, you have to think only your own thoughts, but there are plenty of things that you can see right in front of you that you could be doing if only you were allowed to. In that second room, opportunity costs ought to be quite high. So we just then asked people after being in those different rooms for 15 minutes how bored they were. And it turned out that in the room that we had all of those affordances for action, all of those different options that they could have interacted had we let them, people rated the room to be quite a bit more boring, as we would expect. Now, in that study, a number of people broke the rules. So we had a little coffee mug that had a spy camera in it that allowed us to videotape their behavior. So some of the people, a lot of them interacted with the jigsaw puzzle, some of them played with the Lego puzzle. Even in the empty room, people broke the rules. The rules in the empty room were to sit there with nothing but your thoughts. And in that room, people would get up and pace around. They'd trace their finger along the wall like they were in some kind of prison. People got up and did squats. There were lots of things that people did in that empty room to break the rules. And it was as though, like the mink housed in very bland cages, they were just desperate to do something. It was just not satisfying to be sitting there doing nothing. So more recently, we collected data to ask people about their experiences during the pandemic. And we collected this data at the end of April and start of May of last year. So that people had been in that first period of lockdown for a short period of time. And we asked them a whole range of different things. But what we were interested in is what the relationship was between boredom proneness, so that individual propensity to experience boredom a lot and to experience it intensely. What was the relationship between that and your capacity to adhere to the rules of social distancing? And so what we found was that, in fact, people who are more prone to boredom were more likely to break the rules of social distancing. This is a mediation analysis, and there's a strong relationship between boredom and self-control, which I'll talk about in a little while. But that relationship between self-control, the ability to sort of control your own thoughts, emotions, and actions, any relationship between self-control and your capacity to adhere to social distancing rules was fully mediated by boredom proneness. This is actually one of the first times, actually the only time so far in my research career where we got scooped. There was a group in Germany and Switzerland headed by Vanya Wolf that found pretty much the same thing and published a couple of weeks before we did. The thing about that I like is that it's a sort of built-in replication. We hadn't spoken to that lab at all. We hadn't interacted in any way, and yet we did pretty much the same study and found pretty much the same thing. And it highlights that under these situations of constraint, when we're in this lockdown that we face as a consequence of the pandemic, for people who are prone to boredom, that urge to act is so strong that they even do things that act against their self-interest, breaking those rules of social distancing, much like administering an electric shock, which you could suggest is against your self-interest as well. And we're following up this work. There are a range of other things that we measured in that sort of study that are interesting as well. So boredom is this uncomfortable feeling of an unmet desire to be engaged in something meaningful in your life. And we know that for the highly boredom prone, those individuals who experience boredom intensely and frequently, that there are a range of negative outcomes. People who are prone to boredom have higher rates of depression and anxiety. They tend to use drugs and alcohol more. There's an association between problem gambling and boredom proneness. And each of those things, problems with mental health, with drug and alcohol abuse and problem gambling, each of those things represent a problem of self-regulation or self-control. So I don't know whether or not the guy in this GIF is actually bored while he's standing around waiting for something, but it's entirely plausible that that's what he is. He's feeling a bit of boredom, and so he decides to tip over the garbage bin. Maybe when we're in state of boredom, in the throes of boredom, we all want to do something destructive like that. But most of us tend to exercise a little bit of self-control. But what we found is that for the boredom prone, the individuals who experience boredom a lot, they tend to also have lower levels of self-control. So that ability to sort of corral your thoughts and emotions in the pursuit of goals is harder for the boredom prone individual to do. And this is just one scatter plot of one sample of subjects that we tested in an undergraduate population, but we find this as one of the most consistent and strongest relations that we find in our boredom proneness research. And age plays a role here too. So we find that as we get older, we tend to experience boredom less and have there's sort of lower levels of boredom proneness. And that's what you're looking at on the left there, where we split our samples between the under and over 30-year-olds. But this is true even when we restrict our age range to 17 to 22-year-olds, the typical undergraduate population. And this is a really critical age range. That's the age at which you see the final stages of neural maturation. That frontal cortex that is becoming fully myelinated in that age range, in that late teen, early 20s years. And the frontal cortex, of course, is critical for those self-regulatory, self-control behaviors that the boredom-prone individual struggles with. And on the right, you can see these things all brought together, that again, as we age, we experience boredom less and our self-control levels increase. And one final piece of the puzzle for me comes from work with patients with traumatic brain injury. And actually, this is really one of the starting points for me getting into boredom research. So as a clinical neuropsychologist in Australia, I assessed a number of individuals, usually young men, who had suffered these traumatic brain injuries that quite commonly affect the orbitofrontal cortex, part of the brain that we know that is really important for representing value and reward. And I would ask these patients whether or not they felt more bored after their brain injury than they did beforehand. And to a number, they said yes. And it wasn't just that they said yes, they were kind of excited to have been even asked the question, because it was clearly something that was important in their recovery, that they were struggling to find ways to fully engage with their world pardon me, in ways that they found satisfying prior to their brain injury. But that was all anecdotal. And so recently we, pardon me, recently we tested this in a group of patients with moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. There was about 34 of those patients that you see in the green bar, about 300 or so patients, people who had reported a prior history of having a concussion, so a fairly mild head injury, and then healthy controls who never reported any history of concussion. And you can see that the presence and severity of a brain injury predicts the level of boredom proneness that an individual represents. One of the key characteristics of traumatic brain injury is a difficulty that the patient has in self-regulation and self-control. So it's a key component of that boredom proneness experience. So I try to suggest to you then that boredom is this uncomfortable feeling, and I love this sort of, and that it's a motivational state. And I love this quote from Leo Tolstoy, from Anna Karenina, where he describes boredom as the desire for desires. The reason I like the quote is it highlights the conundrum of boredom. That is that when we're in the state, in the moment of feeling bored, we have that desire to be engaged. We want to be doing something meaningful or purposeful, but we don't know how to satisfy that desire, or we don't believe that anything that's right here in front of us will satisfy that desire. So the highly boredom-prone individual feels that sense, that urge that they want to act, but just fails for whatever reason to satisfy that act, that urge. They fail to sort of launch. That's, again, a kind of anecdotal description. And so we wanted to determine whether or not highly boredom-prone people indeed fail to launch into action. And to look at this, we turned to a distinction in social psychology between what's known as regulatory modes. Essentially, this is just jargon for how we go about pursuing goals. What sort of systems do we engage to pursue goals that we want to attain? And this comes from Ari Kruglansky's work. And they suggest that there are two regulatory modes, two ways of going about pursuing your goals. One that they call locomotion and one that they call assessment. Now, the locomotion guys tend to sort of move very quickly from one action or one goal to another. They kind of just get on with things. So colloquially, you might refer to this as a just do it mode. The assessment focused people instead tend to evaluate the options for action because they want to make sure that they don't make mistakes. So in a sense, you can refer to this group as a kind of do the right thing mode. And what we find is that for people who adopt this locomotion mode that just get on with things and move from one action to the next fairly easily and rapidly, they don't tend to experience boredom much. In contrast, the people who have that assessment regulatory mode that want to make sure that they do the right thing tend to experience boredom more. Now, these relationships are quite moderate in the undergraduate population, but they're stronger in the general population that we've tested through the use of Amazon Mechanical Turk. And they're very, very consistent. We see this time and time again in a lot of different samples that we've tested. So to suggest that for the boredom-prone individual, the conundrum of boredom is that they want to be engaged, but that they fail to launch, sort of still begs the question of why. Anybody who has young children will sort of understand this kind of conundrum and experience. So your child sort of comes to you complaining of being bored, and you either say, there's no such thing, go and sort it out, or you trot out options for them to engage in. You say, you know, why don't you go play basketball with your friends? Or why don't you read a book, God forbid? You give them all kinds of options for things that they ought to be able to launch into. And yet in that moment, when your child grumbles about being bored, every option that you give them, they dismiss. They say, nah, I don't want to do that. And that is that kind of conundrum that is signaled by boredom. And I think there are a range of things that are at play here. It might be that we don't see a good skill challenge fit. The options in front of us might seem like they're either too easy or too hard, and so we don't want to launch into them. We might not see value in the things that are currently available to us. So, you know, the tasks that we could do, tidy the house or prepare for dinner or whatever it is that you could think of doing right now, those things just might not have much value to you in that moment. And you might also sort of think that for the highly boredom prone, they just struggle to want to put the effort in. Maybe things just seem like they're too hard. And so we've tested that among other notions, and I'll show you some of that data here. To test this notion that boredom prone individuals just think that things are not worth the effort, we used an effort discounting task. And in this task, you get two options on every trial. You can do an easy task or a hard task. Now, the easy task was to do 30 button presses within 7 seconds using the index finger of your dominant hand. Kind of sounds hard, but your index finger and your dominant hand is pretty good at this task, and you can get it done pretty easily. The hard task was to do 100 button presses in 21 seconds, this time using your pinky finger of your non-dominant hand. And that's quite a hard task to do. Now, there were different probabilities of winning and different monetary rewards, but those are not that important to what I want to show you right now. We asked people before they did the task how bored they were, and we asked them after the task how bored they were. And these relationships are quite small and moderate, but they're significant nonetheless. So before you even did this task, if you said that you were very bored, then you tended to choose the easy way out. You tended to choose the easy options more so than the hard tasks. And then at the end of the task, if you rated yourself as being more bored by the end of doing this task, you also were more likely to have chosen those easy tasks. And what this suggests to me is that there's a kind of vicious cycle going on here, that in the first instance, when you feel bored, you take the easy option. But after having done the easy option for 30 minutes or so, you're even more bored now because that easy option was not satisfying or stimulating. And so for the boredom prone, there may well be this kind of vicious cycle of not putting in the effort to find something that will be sufficiently engaging. And because you don't put that effort in, that makes you more susceptible to the continued and prolonged experience of boredom. So I've tried to suggest to you that boredom represents rising opportunity costs. So that experiment of people sitting in an empty room with options to engage in. I've suggested to you that it's an uncomfortable and unpleasant experience. It's a very negative experience. And there's lots of research from others, my colleague Wijnand van Tilburg in particular, that show that it is a negative emotional experience. And I've just suggested to you that perhaps the boredom-prone individuals, or when we're all bored, we sort of feel like things aren't really worth our effort. But what we really needed was a sort of behavioral assay of boredom, some sort of task that we could use that would allow us to make distinctions between how high and low boredom-prone individuals might behave. And to do that, we turned to foraging. And the reason we turned to foraging, there were many reasons why we turned to foraging. The first of those is that foraging explicitly requires that you balance two drives. One drive to exploit resources that are right in front of you, and a second drive that you explore your environment for better resources when the need arises. And you need to balance those two drives. So it may well be that boredom is the signal to say, we've done an exploiting phase here now, we need to move on and explore our environments for other resources or better things to engage with. In another sense, these foraging tasks are quite rich in the information that they can provide you. You can look at the actual path length that a person travels through a foraging environment. You can look at the number of berries that they pick or the kind of berries they pick. Do they always go for big ones versus small ones, and so on? And so that rich sort of set of metrics we thought was going to be quite promising in terms of looking at distinguishing between high and low boredom prone people. And finally, we established a collaboration with an evolutionary biologist, Marla Sokolovsky at the University of Toronto. And Marla does some work in Drosophila melanogaster, the fruit fly, where she looks at different phenotypes on the foraging gene. And so we thought foraging would be a great behavior to start with, to try and see whether or not the phenotypes that Marla sees in the fruit fly are conserved in the human. Because if they were, then you'd start to think about quite a long evolutionary history for something like boredom. So what does Marla's work show? What does she find in the fruit fly? What you're looking at here are heat maps for fruit fly larvae placed in a dish where there are 4 different food sources. And the heat maps are just showing you where the larva explored that dish to try and find the food. On the left is a column of the animals when they're fully sated, so they've been well fed. And on the right is a column when the animals had spent 24 hours of food deprivation. So the FD stands for food deprivation. The top column is one of the phenotypes that Marla talks about that she labels the rover. And the bottom column is the other phenotype, the sitter. Now, the rover tends to explore their environment quite extensively. In contrast, the sitter tends to hug the boundary of their environment. And you can think about these things in 2 ways. And the second way is another reason why we turned to foraging. But the first is to sort of think about it in terms of risk tolerance. For the animal to get away from the boundary of their environment, they're engaging in higher risk levels. They're putting themselves at a risk of being hunted by predators in some sense, in these kinds of tasks that we use in animal physiology. So the rover has a higher level of risk tolerance. They explore their environment more extensively. In contrast, the sitter might have fairly low risk tolerance. They're trying to be very careful and plodding in their exploration of the environment. The second way in which this is interesting to us is that you might imagine that the rover looks a little bit like a human locomotor. They get on with things. They get out and explore their environment rapidly and efficiently. The sitter, on the other hand, with their low level of risk tolerance, might be more like our human assessors that are sort of deliberating on what the best course of action might be. That might sound like a bit of a stretch, but that's certainly what our starting point was. So we developed our own foraging task. What we did is we had people swiping their way through a virtual berry patch. And so they were doing this on a touch screen. A sideways swipe allowed them to move through the patch. And then they would see these red berries of various sizes that they could tap on to collect. It was a large environment, 20,000 by 20,000 pixels wide. So it was quite an extensive environment for them to explore through. And it again gives us a lot of opportunities here to manipulate things in interesting ways. What I'm going to show you now comes from a version of the task in which we had a uniform distribution of berries across the environment. But of course, we could manipulate that. We could make a scarce environment where the berries were not uniformly distributed and so on. So we did this, and then our first attempt to try and understand what the behavior was looking at just looked at fairly basic metrics, things like path length and the number of berries picked. And those sort of fairly simple metrics didn't really differentiate between high and low boredom prone individuals. So instead, we turned to path classification. That is some algorithms, and we used various algorithms as well as just human eyeball classification, that allow you to classify search path behavior into different kind of groups. And what you see on the left is our largest group, so about 260 people. Everybody starts in this environment in the center, and you can see that this boundary biased group found the boundary and then hugged it. And already you ought to be able to guess that there's an association brewing here between that kind of behavior in our foraging task and what we see in the fruit fly sitter. We had another group of people that we called systematic. They sort of moved left and right or up and down fairly systematically through the environment. And our final group we labeled mixed because we couldn't really easily or reliably classify them as either boundary biased or systematic. In this sample then, we took spit samples so that we could look at the human ortholog of the foraging gene, which is known as PRKG1. What you're looking at here, just as a first look through that, is those heat maps that I've already shown you. On the right now at the top for the fruit fly is the sitter, and on the left is the rover. And on the bottom, you're looking at heat maps for our human participants that are homozygous A or C allele carriers on that human ortholog of the foraging gene, PRKG1. And you can see from these heat maps that the homozygous A allele carriers tend to spend more time on the boundary, looking a little bit like those fruit fly sitters, whereas the homozygous C allele carriers on PRKG1 tend to explore their environment a little bit more extensively. So we quantified this in a range of different ways. Then we looked first at a preference in our human sample for locomotion or assessment as a regulatory mode. And that's what you're looking at on the top there. So positive numbers represent a preference for locomotion and negative numbers a preference for assessment. And you find that the homozygous A allele carriers show a preference for the assessment focus. And the homozygous C allele carriers a preference for locomotion. Those same individuals that prefer the assessment focus tend to also prefer to hug the boundary of our environment. So what you're seeing there is that in those individuals, they show behavior that looks a lot like the behavior we see in the fruit fly sitter, and that they also tend to prefer in these questionnaire methods that we use that assessment focus, regulatory focus. Of course, we want to know what's going on with boredom, proneness, and self-control. So those same individuals that prefer an assessment regulatory mode and hug the boundary of their foraging environment also tend to have higher levels of boredom, proneness, and lower levels of self-control. And so we're in the process of exploring this and trying to replicate it in another sample. Pardon me. But that's at least encouraging that there's potentially this sort of boredom-prone phenotype. We've looked at other genes that are potentially relevant for the boredom-prone individual. Here I'm just showing you COMT and DAT, sometimes referred to as DA1. COMT we know is important for the regulation of catecholamines like dopamine. And here we see that individuals that are homozygous on the T allele are higher in boredom proneness and lower in self-control. And similarly for the DAT gene, those who are homozygous T allele carriers tend to be higher in boredom proneness and lower in self-control. And you tend to see that pattern in many of the genes that we've been looking at, where we see if you find that there's some polymorphism related to boredom proneness, so that one group is higher on boredom proneness than another, you see that there's a similar pattern for self-control as well. So as I mentioned, we're in the process of replicating this work because it's quite important to do so for single candidate gene studies. So you'll have to stay tuned to see whether or not we're successful in doing that or not. And I'll turn now to talk a little bit about some of the neuroscience that or neuroimaging that we've done to look at the state of boredom and boredom proneness more generally. And it's important to sort of suggest that the neuroscience of boredom and boredom proneness is still really in its infancy. There's not a lot of studies out there, but there's some interesting things to sort of look at. With my postdoc, Ophir Jacobi, we just recently did an EEG study, and you're looking at here these topographical maps of EEG signals for the P300 on the top and the error-related negativity on the bottom, while people were performing a go-no-go task. So in this go-no-go task, a fairly standard sort of task, people are responding with a button press to most stimuli on every single trial, but then on a handful of trials, they have to withhold that response. They have to inhibit that response. It's a task that requires sustained attention and to some extent response inhibition. And what we find is that people's in-the-moment feelings of boredom are related to the ERP signals that we see. So there is a reduced amplitude of both the P300 and the ERN for people who rate their experience as being more boring. I've split those event-related potentials up by a median split on the right, just so you can see that difference. The people who are high in their ratings of state boredom have a lower amplitude P3, and even though the lines are flipped for the error-related negativity, that is a reduced amplitude ERN as well. Now, this sort of fits with a range of research that we and others have done, showing that boredom and boredom proneness are related to difficulties with sustaining attention. So that it makes a fair bit of sense when you think about it, that when we're bored, we are struggling to focus and maintain our attention on the thing that is right there in front of us. We're struggling to engage effectively. And this just provides some EEG evidence to support that. We also looked at resting state EEG activity, and what you're looking at here is power in the alpha band as a function of boredom proneness. So what I just showed you were ERP findings related to state boredom metrics. Here we find that for people who are higher in boredom proneness, they have lower alpha power, and they also have lower theta power. And again, we would suggest that these findings implicate problems and challenges with focusing and maintaining attention as a function of boredom proneness. If I turn now to functional MRI, there's not a lot of studies out there to sort of go on, but there's some that I think are quite interesting. This comes from Martin Ulrich and colleagues in Germany. And they were actually interested not in boredom, but in the state of flow, which some might consider the sort of opposite of boredom, if you like. The state of flow is this sort of state of very intense engagement where you're so focused on what it is that you're doing right now that the world seems to just fall away. And it just, nothing else matters but that thing that you're intensely focused on. To look at this, they had people do these mathematical problems that either were tailored to their particular skill level, and that they considered to be a flow condition, which they represent in these green bars here, or they did these math problems that were a lot harder than their skill level, and they counted this as an overload condition, so that's represented in the blue bars, or they did these math sums that were just so painfully easy that they expected that it would lead to boredom, and that's represented in the red bars there. So for flow, they get activity in the left inferior frontal gyrus and putamen, but for our purposes, what we're interested in is what they find for boredom, and in the boredom condition, they see medial prefrontal activation and the amygdala. And you'll see that in work that we did, that I'll show you in a few slides, that we too get this medial prefrontal cortical activation that is part of what's known as the default mode network, and that'll become relevant in a couple of seconds. In a similar sort of design of study, DelmasWhitman had people do 3 different kinds of tasks. So they had people do a really boring task, then they did a sort of cognitively demanding task, which is a visual search task. And then they had a task that was simply showing them pictures and asking their participants to say, how much do you like this picture or not? So it's just a sort of preference task. The key thing that they did here, which I think was really cool, was to say at the end of each of these tasks, how much money would you pay for a music download? And the idea is that if you're really, really bored, kind of like the mink lunging for any sort of object that they possibly can, if you're a human and you're really bored, maybe you'll pay more money for a music download because you're just desperate to overcome that boredom. And that's indeed what they found. So the 2 graphs on the top show you that after the boredom condition, people said, yeah, I'll pay more money for a music download now, just get me the hell out of here. And on the bottom, what you're looking at is that the amount of money people were willing to pay after they were bored was correlated with activity in a part of the cortex known as the anterior insular cortex. Now, the anterior insular is part of what's known as the salience network, and it's important for representing sort of behaviorally relevant information, things that are important to you in that moment. So in their study, you're seeing upregulation of the insular cortex when people are sort of trying to find something relevant to engage in because they've just been bored. But none of those studies, and I'll see if this video works here. I don't know if the sound coming through. Okay, I'll let it play for a little while. But I won't let it play for too long because I can't stand it. So this is none of the 2 studies that I just showed you actually actively induced boredom. They inferred boredom as a function of the tasks that they had people do. So we wanted to do an fMRI study where we actually induced the state of boredom, made people bored, and then looked at what was happening in the brain. And to do that, my graduate student, Colleen Merrifield, developed this video of two guys hanging laundry. And typically the first response people have when they start seeing this is laughter, which I think is, you know, just it's such an unexpected video that people think you've got to be kidding. But after about 10 or 15 seconds, when you realize that no, the researchers are serious and they're going to make me watch 8 minutes of this, then boredom sets in pretty rapidly and pretty strongly. So we first collected what's called a resting state scan. So in that resting state scan, you just ask people to sit there for a certain period of time and do nothing. And what you expect to see in a resting state scan is activity in the default mode network. And this is what I'm showing you here. You can see on the top image there, activity of the posterior cingulate and precuneus. We see also a little bit, you can see it in that slice, activity of the medial prefrontal cortex. And in the bottom slice, you see activity in the bilateral inferior parietal cortex. The default mode network is activated when there is nothing external in the environment for us to do. So if there's no task right in front of you to do at that particular moment, you activate this so-called default mode network. And it is activated in ways that are very self-referential. So you might see activation in the default mode when you're engaging in nostalgic reverie, when you're thinking about your past. You might see activation in the default mode network when you're thinking prospectively about your future. What have I got on tonight? What am I doing this weekend? These kinds of thoughts. And you might also see activation in the default mode network when you're simply mind wandering. So there's nothing external for you to do and you're letting your mind wander. So we did that scan particularly because we wanted to contrast it directly with our boredom mood induction. And in our boredom mood induction, we find pretty much the same network of brain areas. That default mode network is activated when you're bored. The key distinction here, though, is there is something in the environment for you to do. There's a movie to watch. It just so happens that that movie is so mind-numbingly dull that you can't really focus your attention on it and stay engaged. And so you end up activating this default mode network. Now, of course, we needed a control condition. And so our control condition was to have people watch 8 minutes of a BBC Blue Planet clip. And you see that you down-regulate the default mode network in that instance. So now it's not shown here. You actually upload attention-based networks and central executive networks when you're engaged with something that's interesting, like the BBC Blue Planet documentary. Now, if all we found out was that when we make you bored, you have the same default mode activation as when you're doing nothing, that might have been a little disappointing. But when we looked a little more closely, we found that in the resting state scan, there was no activity, no up or down regulation of the insular cortex. But in our boredom scan, we did see down regulation of the insular cortex. And again, if we looked at our control, this particular part of the brain was upregulated when you were watching something interesting. So in the hands of DelmasWhitman, where people had to pay for a music download, you see upregulation of the insular cortex as people are desperately trying to get out of being bored. When you get stuck in a bored state, the insular cortex shuts off as if it sort of recognizes that there's really nothing to be done here. There's nothing salient, nothing relevant in our environment. As I mentioned, this is all in the very early stages, and there's a whole hell of a lot more to do. Particularly, I'd be interested in trying to understand the brain states of people who are prone to the experience of boredom. And that just needs much larger numbers of people. So we're in the process of doing that kind of work as well. So I've tried to convince you that boredom is an uncomfortable kind of state, but that it's also a call to action, that it's urging us to engage in something that matters to us. And Robert White in the late 50s is the first person I know of who talked about a sort of the urge to act as a kind of basic drive that is evident not just in humans, but also in other animals. He focused mostly on mammals. And what Robert White called this was effectants motivation. The idea is that the animal is driven to demonstrate their own efficacy in their environment, driven to show that my actions have an outcome on the world around me. They affect some kind of change. One of the examples I love to think about in this is to think of anyone who's ever had children, when you put your infant child in a high chair and they pick things up off the high chair and they drop them off the side. The infant is not just trying to piss their parent off. What they're trying to do is explore the physics of their world. When I drop this thing, does it splat? Does it bounce? Does it make a noise? Does it piss mum off? Whatever it is that they're trying to do, they're trying to explore their world. They're demonstrating their effectants, their efficacy, that when they act, the world changes in some measurable, observable way. And now Robert White's sort of notion was a theoretical one. He didn't have any experiments, but he drew on a lot of experiments in animals at the time. And one of the ones that I like came from Harlow and colleagues in the 50s, where they had non-human primates that were fully sated, so they weren't working for food or juice rewards, and they would work only for the reward of being able to open a slot in their cage that gave them a view into the laboratory that they previously didn't have. So they were working to make a change in their environment, to get some kind of new stimuli. And what I would like to suggest here is that boredom is a call to action, in part because when we're bored, we're not being effective agents. We're not demonstrating our own effectiveness, and we need to do that in order to feel good. And I choose this image here intentionally. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I am sure that once you are aware of it, you may or may not change your behavior. The closed door buttons on the inside of elevators are useless. They actually do nothing. They might be associated with a little LED light that shows you that you push the button, but the door will close according to prearranged algorithms. Your pushing of the button has no effect. The same is actually true of many crosswalk buttons in New York City, and I'm suspecting in big cities like Toronto, and the closed door buttons in the London Underground on their trains. The buttons are there to make humans feel good about themselves. That's all they're there for. And they work because you do push that button and feel like you made the door close, and that feels good because you demonstrated your own efficacy, your own agency. If I return to the anecdotes of young children, again, anyone who's had their 4-year-old come up to a crosswalk knows that experience, the 4-year-old pushing the button over and over and over again. And it doesn't matter that you tell the 4-year-old once is enough. They feel good pushing the button and trying to make the light change. And I think that need for agency, that need for efficacy is really quite important. One of the things that Robert White suggested is that early life satisfaction of effectants motivation is really important for the development of self-esteem. We're in the process now of trying to look at the association between boredom and boredom proneness and self-efficacy. But as a first pass, we already had data available to us to look at that relationship between boredom and self-esteem. And as you can see here, it's quite a strong negative correlation. People who are high in boredom proneness tend to be lower in self-esteem. And I would suggest that that challenge to their self-esteem is because of a challenge to their sense of efficacy or agency. And we're in the process of trying to investigate that more deeply now. So Zoom is actually making this hard for me to read this quote out myself because I've got all these images on the side here. So I'll do my best to try and remember it, but I might have to paraphrase it and you can read the quotes for yourself. But I'm returning to Eric Fromm to give him his full due because it's not fair that I just used the tiny part of his quote. But he says, man is the only animal that can be bored, that can find himself evicted from paradise. Man is the only animal who finds his own existence a problem that he has to solve and from which he cannot escape. This is casting boredom explicitly as a need for meaning. And I don't want to suggest that that's not true. There's clearly a lot of work out there. I mentioned Wijnand van Tilburg, and there are others who've done a lot of really good work showing that indeed boredom is associated with a sense that what you're doing right now lacks meaning, and perhaps also a sense that your life in general lacks meaning. So there is a really strong relationship there for humans. But what I want to suggest to you is that over and above any sense of meaning, we also have a need to demonstrate our own agency. And there could be circumstances in which we have meaningful things to do, but we're still not demonstrating agency. I keep returning to children. If you've ever been around a 4-year-old when they first learn knock-knock jokes, you'll understand that what they do is they engage in their own knock-knock jokes, none of which are funny. Because what they've learned is they've learned the structure. Knock, knock, who's there, blah, 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 right? So they just tell you over and over again these knock-knock jokes that maintain the structure they've learned because they're excited about that structure, but that are just not funny. But as a good parent, you laugh at their unfunny knock-knock jokes. And because you laugh at it, you reward them and they do it again. And very quickly, you're in a highly meaningful, highly boring situation. And I would suggest here that it's boring because you're not demonstrating agency. The child is in complete control. So I think independent of meaning, our need for agency is a really important driver of how we experience boredom. So this leads to a kind of problem or challenge. And it's both a philosophical sort of challenge, I think, and it's also an experimental design challenge. And the philosophical challenge is this: I have no trouble believing that the mink that Georgia and Rebecca studied so well, and that plenty of other animals experience boredom, perhaps as a challenge to their own need for efficacy, their own need to demonstrate their agency. I don't think animals are that much different than us in terms of wanting to show that they can affect change in their environments. But do they need meaning? Do they need the changes that they engage in their life to be imbued with meaning? And that's a challenge that I'm going to leave to the clever people that are in this audience. And I'll thank you all for listening. These are my collaborators. My graduate students, Andrew Struck and Jyotisha Mugon, did the lion's share of the work that I sort of presented to you today. And they're just some of the most fantastic students I've ever had. My collaborator, John Eastwood, and I have been talking about boredom a lot over the last little while. And so he and I are doing a lot of work together, but there are other collaborators that you see there. I don't think I can get away with giving a talk nowadays without doing some shameless self-promotion. So here's the book that John Eastwood and I published last year, Out of My Skull, The Psychology of Boredom. It makes a great gift, even though we're past Christmas. And I thought also that for this audience, I didn't think I'd be able to get away without putting a picture up of my rescue dog, Jelly. We think Jelly is a Kweekahonja, a Dutch water dog. But the pandemic has been absolutely fantastic for Jelly. He doesn't experience boredom quite so much anymore because he's got us around 24/7. And for us, that means that our shoes are saved to the consequences of his boredom. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to sort of take any questions that people have. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, why not? And then we can see you and everyone.